The night did not begin with cruelty, yet cruelty found her all the same. Beneath the blazing chandeliers of Harrington Hall, where crystal light spilled like molten gold upon polished marble, society gathered in silks and tailored black coats, perfumed and immaculate, prepared to celebrate nothing more profound than its own reflection. Music drifted from the far end of the ballroom, violins sighing with practiced elegance, while laughter rose and fell like a well-trained chorus. It was here, amid this careful splendor, that her disgrace was meant to remain invisible. Instead, it announced itself without sound. She stood near a column veined with white marble, gloved hands folded, spine straight, chin lifted in defiance, so restrained it appeared almost serene. The gown she wore was modest but precise, dove-gray silk that neither begged attention nor hid her entirely. It was the kind of dress chosen by a woman who understood that survival, in certain rooms, depended upon not seeming to hope. Her name passed quietly from mouth to mouth, never spoken aloud in her presence, always softened by politeness and sharpened by intent. There had been a time, not long ago, when doors opened for her without hesitation. Tonight, invitations stalled. A gentleman approached, paused, and retreated with a murmured excuse. A lady inclined her head politely, then turned away as though drawn by an urgent thought. No insult was delivered directly. That would have been vulgar. Instead, she was edited out of the evening, erased in full view, made to feel her absence while standing plainly among them. The narrator of such moments, had there been one, might have observed how Victorian society excelled not at open cruelty, but at omission. A woman need not be accused to be condemned. All it required was silence, and silence had gathered around her like winter fog. She did not flinch. Her composure, earned through long practice, remained intact even as humiliation pressed against her ribs. Shame, when endured often enough, becomes a discipline. Yet beneath her calm exterior memory stirred, of promises once implied, of protection withdrawn when it mattered most, of a truth twisted until it became a liability she alone was expected to bear. Tonight was not the first time she had been judged. It was merely the most public. Then the room shifted. It was subtle at first, like the hush before a storm. Conversations softened. Laughter dimmed. A ripple of awareness moved outward from the grand entrance, drawing glances as instinctively as moths to flame. He had arrived. The Duke of Ashbourne entered with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to deference. Tall, dark-haired, composed to the point of severity, he wore his rank as others wore gloves, effortlessly, without display. His presence altered the air, straightened postures, summoned smiles that had not existed moments earlier. This was a man whose future had been charted before his birth, whose name carried weight long before he learned to speak it. He acknowledged greetings with measured nods, eyes alert yet distant, as though already bored by admiration. His life had been constructed from expectation, and he bore it with the weary elegance of one who had never been offered an alternative. Until his gaze found her. It was not dramatic. He did not stop walking, nor did he stare. Yet something in his expression changed, a hesitation, almost imperceptible, like a breath caught before it escaped. In that instant, the rigid lines of his composure softened, and curiosity, sharp and dangerous, took root. He knew who she was. Of that there was no doubt. Everyone did. The whispers had traveled faster than truth, carried on the breath of people who mistook judgment for virtue. He had heard her story told in fragments, each retelling more damning than the last. He had been warned, gently and often, that she was not to be noticed. Still, he looked. She felt it before she saw him. The awareness settled against her skin, unfamiliar and unsettling. When she turned, their eyes met across the breadth of the ballroom, and for one suspended moment, the noise fell away. His gaze held no accusation, no pity. Only attention, undiluted and unsettling in its sincerity. He inclined his head. It was a small gesture, perfectly polite, easily dismissed by any observer. Yet in that bow lived something subversive. Recognition. Acknowledgment. He had seen her, and worse, he had chosen not to look away. A few nearby guests noticed. A pause here. A raised brow there. The rules of the room shuddered, uncertain. She returned the nod, her fingers tightening briefly within her gloves, pulse betraying her calm. Nothing else occurred. No words were exchanged. No scandal declared. Yet the balance had shifted, and everyone felt it, even if they pretended not to. As the Duke moved deeper into the hall, conversation resumed, thinner than before. She remained by the column, unchanged in posture but altered in spirit, aware now that something irrevocable had begun. In a room that had carefully unmade her, one man had done the unthinkable. He had looked where he was forbidden to look. The Duke did not approach her again that evening, and yet his presence followed her like an echo. Long after the final waltz dissolved and the chandeliers dimmed, society spoke of nothing else. Not aloud, of course. Victorian tongues preferred discretion. But in drawing-rooms and breakfast parlors the following morning, his glance was dissected, magnified, and sharpened into speculation. Why had he looked? Why had he bowed? Why her? In a world sustained by order, even the smallest deviation was a provocation. She learned of it through omission once more. An invitation failed to arrive. A customary note of courtesy went unanswered. Even her dressmaker, once eager, now measured her with cool efficiency. The Duke's attention had not redeemed her. It had unsettled her position further. To be shunned was one thing. To be noticed by a man of his rank was another entirely, and far more dangerous. She told herself it would end there. Men of his station did not indulge passing curiosities for long. They returned to their rightful paths, guided by inheritance and expectation, and left disruptions behind them like forgotten scenery. She repeated this to herself each morning, fastening her gloves, smoothing her hair, practicing indifference until it felt almost real. Then the book arrived. It was delivered without a name, wrapped in plain brown paper, the corners worn soft with age. Inside, pressed between the title page and the first chapter, lay a single dried flower, lavender, carefully preserved. The book itself was a volume of poetry, its margins faintly marked by an earlier reader's hand. No message accompanied it, yet the gesture was unmistakable. Someone had chosen it. Someone had thought of her. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages. The verses spoke of restraint, of devotion deferred, of love surviving in silence. It was an intimate selection, dangerous in its thoughtfulness. This was not a grand bouquet or a public declaration. It was quieter, more deliberate. It suggested observation, understanding. She did not need to ask who had sent it. In that era, gifts were never merely gifts. They were arguments made without words, statements cloaked in plausibility. Should she be questioned, she could deny knowledge of the sender. Should he be accused, he could claim courtesy. Yet both would know the truth. The book was a bridge, extended cautiously, across forbidden ground. She waited days before acknowledging it, fearing what response might invite. When she finally encountered him again, it was in the most innocuous of settings, a charity gathering held beneath the guise of benevolence. Lace-draped tables displayed donations. Polite applause marked empty speeches. The Duke stood near a window, listening with a detached courtesy of one accustomed to obligation. He noticed her immediately. This time, he approached. Their exchange was brief, formally impeccable. He spoke of the weather, of the evening's cause, of nothing at all. Then, softly, as though offering a remark no one else need hear, he mentioned a line from the very book he had sent. Her breath caught. She answered with another. Their eyes met, and the understanding between them sharpened, bright and perilous. It was enough. By the following week, rumor hardened into accusation. He was seen offering her his arm. He was heard defending her name in a drawing-room where it had been used unkindly. Each act was small, defensible, yet cumulative. Society responded as it always did when challenged, with teeth bared behind smiles. His family noticed. His mother's letters grew urgent, her language edged with concern thinly veiled as command. His future was discussed in tones of warning. He listened, unreadable, his expression composed even as tension coiled beneath it. He had been raised to protect the title, to preserve the lineage, to avoid precisely this sort of complication. She, meanwhile, retreated. The book lay hidden in a drawer. The flower was pressed deeper into its pages. She began declining invitations altogether, choosing absence over exposure. Each day she expected his attention to fade, and each day it did not. The scandal reached its peak on an evening soaked in rain. They stood together beneath the portico of a townhouse, the storm loud enough to mask conversation. Someone saw them there, too close, too intent. By morning, the story had spread, reshaped into something far sharper than truth. She received a note at dawn, written in a firm, unmistakable hand. It contained no apology, no retreat. Only a request to see her, and the quiet implication that he would not be dissuaded. As she folded the paper, her resolve faltered. What had begun as a glance had become a reckoning. Somewhere beyond reputation and restraint, a choice waited, and she feared it would cost them both everything. They met where no witnesses lingered, in the quiet library of her rented house, a room too narrow for grandeur and too honest for pretense. Rain pressed insistently against the tall windows, blurring the gaslit street beyond into trembling streaks of gold. The hour was improper enough to invite judgment, yet restrained enough to remain defensible. In that narrow space between scandal and silence, they stood facing one another, the air weighted with words long deferred. He removed his gloves slowly, deliberately, as though aware that even the smallest gesture might fracture what little control remained between them. The Duke of Ashbourne looked different here, stripped of chandeliers and admirers. The severity of him softened, replaced by something rawer, almost uncertain. His eyes, dark and searching, never left her face. She did not invite him to sit. "I should not have come," she said first, her voice steady despite the storm within it. "Nor should you have asked." "No," he replied quietly. "But I did." Silence followed, dense and deliberate. The ticking clock upon the mantel seemed unnaturally loud, marking each second as though it mattered. She folded her hands together, the familiar posture of restraint returning instinctively. It had been her armor for so long that she scarcely noticed wearing it. "You must end this," she continued. "Whatever this is that society insists upon naming. It has already gone too far." He took a step closer, then stopped himself, as if obeying an invisible line. "You speak as though it were rumor alone that binds us." "It is rumor that will destroy you," she answered, finally meeting his gaze. "And it is my name they will use to do it." Her composure wavered then, just enough to reveal the cost beneath it. He saw the fatigue she hid so well, the careful dignity stretched thin by constant defense. In that moment, admiration sharpened into something more perilous. "You believe I do not understand the consequences," he said. "That I have not been instructed in them since childhood." She smiled faintly, without warmth. "You have been taught consequence as theory. I have lived it as punishment." The truth of it struck him with quiet force. He moved again, closer now, compelled despite himself. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows like insistence itself. "I will not pretend," he said, his voice low. "I sought you out knowing precisely what they would say. I continued knowing what they would threaten. And still, I did not stop." "Why?" The question escaped her before caution could restrain it. He hesitated only once. "Because silence in your presence felt like cowardice." Her breath caught. She turned away, crossing the room to the window, placing distance between them with measured grace. Outside, carriages passed, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding within. "You do not belong in my ruin," she said. "I have already been made an example of. I will not be the instrument of yours." His reply came without delay. "You are not my ruin." She laughed softly, a sound edged with disbelief. "You say that because you still have everything." "I have a title," he corrected. "An inheritance. A future arranged by hands long dead. These things are not the same as everything." She turned back then, eyes bright with unshed emotion. "And what would you have in their place?" He met her without flinching. "Truth." The word hung between them, fragile and immense. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, its seal unbroken. He held it out, not offering it to her, but allowing her to see. "My mother sent this yesterday," he said. It contains forgiveness, should I require it. Provided I step away. Provided I forget you. Her chest tightened. And you have not replied. No, he said. Because doing so would require a lie I am no longer willing to tell. She closed her eyes. In that moment, the careful structure of her resolve began to fracture. Every instinct urged her to protect him, even from himself. You will lose more than comfort, she whispered. They will not be kind. He stepped closer still, stopping only an arm's length away. Nor were they kind to you. Yet you endured. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not the Duke but the man beneath the title, standing willingly at the edge of exile. I cannot ask this of you, she said. You have not, he replied. That is why it is mine to give. The clock struck the hour. Neither moved. Outside, the rain began to ease, as though the world itself held its breath. And in that quiet, unguarded space, she understood that whatever followed would be irreversible, because he had already chosen, and fate itself was waiting for her answer. The ballroom of Ashbourne Manor shimmered with more brilliance than the city itself that evening. Crystal chandeliers reflected in polished marble floors, spilling gold upon gowns of silk and satin, and the air was thick with perfume, candle smoke, and the subtle weight of expectation. Guests murmured in clusters, delicate laughter masking suspicion, gloved fingers brushing against one another as whispers traveled like wildfire. In this arena of eyes and etiquette, the Duke had long been a master of measured poise. Tonight, however, his every movement defied the invisible rules that had governed him since birth. She entered beside him, not behind, not discreetly, but at his side, as though the world's judgment were a shadow to be ignored. Her gown of deep emerald, cut simply but with the elegance of refined taste, caught the lamplight in subtle waves. Every whispered comment ceased mid-utterance. Eyes followed, not from curiosity alone, but from the shock of audacity. Society was accustomed to viewing women in compliance, either demurely removed or resignedly tolerated. She belonged to neither category. And the Duke, who had always obeyed tradition, now stood as her equal in the public eye. His hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a touch both protective and declarative. A hush fell over the room as he guided her to a place of honor near the raised dais. The orchestra faltered in a crescendo, sensing the tremor in social order, then resumed with cautious precision. Ladies of impeccable reputation exchanged raised brows. Men whispered in astonishment, adjusting cravats as though the air itself had become improper. Yet the Duke, unmoved by their scrutiny, drew a deep breath and spoke in a voice both steady and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, every word deliberate, weighted, impossible to ignore. "Tonight, I make a choice. One that defies expectation and challenges the comforts of tradition." He paused, scanning the room with a measured calm, ensuring each listener grasped the gravity. "I have chosen, against the counsel of many and the dictates of fortune, to stand beside Miss Evelyn Hartwell, not as a favor, nor as a concession, but because her presence is necessary to the life I intend to lead." A ripple passed through the gathering, the faintest quiver of indignation and disbelief. Conversations halted mid-sentence, glances sharpened into scrutiny. He did not falter. His gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering, magnetic. And she, feeling the weight of centuries of expectation bearing down upon them, dared to meet it, head held high, chest steady. Shame and fear pressed at her, but they were overshadowed by the realization that she was no longer invisible, no longer subject to the silent erasure that had haunted her steps. The murmurs grew louder. His family, present in stately observation, stiffened. His mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clutched at her fan as though it could shield her from scandal. Letters, arguments, and warnings whispered in drawing-rooms had failed to deter him. Tonight, in the heart of Ashbourne Manor, he had made their defiance public, irreversible, and absolute. He continued, voice unwavering, as though narrating a fate long premeditated. "I am aware of what society may deem unwise. I am aware of the inheritance I risk, the alliances I compromise, and the judgment I invite. Yet these are small matters when compared to truth and loyalty. Miss Hartwell is not a subject for speculation. She is not an accessory to convenience. She is, in every measure that matters, My chosen companion in life, in fortune, and in love. Her pulse raced, but she did not move. The declaration, though formal, carried a heat that ignited every nerve. She felt it in the brush of his fingers against her arm, in the curve of his words that wrapped her like a vow, in the unspoken acknowledgment that she was no longer alone against the world. Yet with triumph came fear, as each syllable spoke not only of love but of consequence. Titles could be forfeited, estates could be contested, relationships could fracture. Society would not forget. It would strike, subtle and relentless, at the edges of their union. A gentleman from the far end of the room cleared his throat, a polite but sharp interruption, as though questioning propriety could undo what had been declared. The Duke inclined his head, offering acknowledgment without surrender. You may regard this choice with skepticism, he said, but skepticism does not diminish its truth. And those who oppose it do so at the peril of understanding the loyalty and devotion it embodies. His eyes, dark and unwavering, returned to her, and the room seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, she felt the entirety of his intention laid bare, not as theory, not as gesture, but as lived conviction. The orchestra resumed, now softer, uncertain of rhythm, as though the music itself had been asked to witness rebellion. She could feel the whispers, feel them curling around her like smoke, but they no longer commanded her. Every glance, every raised brow, every sigh of disapproval was counterbalanced by the undeniable truth. The Duke had chosen, publicly and irrevocably, to defy expectation for her sake. Yet the cost of choice was immediate and tangible. Invitations that had been secured vanished. Subtle exclusions emerged in conversation and event planning. His mother spoke no more, retreating behind her authority, her disappointment measured yet palpable. Even the Duke's closest companions murmured in hushed tones, uncertainty clouding their usually impenetrable loyalty. The path he had chosen was now a battlefield, lined with silent hostility and whispered threats. She understood, in the deep hollows of her chest, that love had never existed in isolation. It demanded courage, and the courage required a reckoning with the world. Yet in the quiet spaces between those murmurs, in the steadied rhythm of his presence beside her, she felt a new kind of certainty. They would face consequence together, as he had promised in that private moment of confession, and in that realization, the terror became a kind of exhilaration. The night wore on. The ballroom, a labyrinth of mirrors and expectation, eventually surrendered to exhaustion. Guests departed with polite bows and whispered judgments, leaving the Duke and her standing near the hearth, flames casting long shadows that intertwined like their destinies. In that flickering light, she could see not just the weight he bore, but the freedom he claimed, freedom of choice, freedom to love without compromise. And she, who had endured so much to remain upright, felt her own courage swell in return. He did not speak further, for words were no longer necessary. The declaration had been made, the social war initiated, and the boundaries of propriety challenged beyond repair. Yet in the quiet aftermath, before consequence could settle like dust upon their shoulders, a single truth hung in the air, more potent than any rumor or insult. They had chosen one another, and nothing that followed could undo the audacity of that choice. Outside, the night wind stirred, carrying with it the first hint of winter. It rattled the windows, pressed cold against the panes, and reminded them that the world beyond the manor had not paused for their decision. They would face whispers, letters, and meetings designed to fracture resolve. They would confront disinheritance, exclusion, and quiet scorn. But within the walls of Ashbourne Manor, beside the hearth, the first ember of certainty had been lit, and it would not be extinguished. As they stepped toward the doorway together, a servant arrived with a message, formal and precise. The Duke unfolded the note, scanning its contents with a practiced calm. She glimpsed only a few words: warning, urgency, consequence, and yet the expression that crossed his face was not fear nor hesitation, but quiet resolve. The social war had begun in earnest, and their victory, though claimed in declaration, remained precarious, teetering between audacity and ruin. In that moment, they shared a glance that required no words. Everything lay ahead: challenge, judgment, sacrifice. Yet the certainty of choice, the clarity of commitment, was unshakable. Whatever storms approached, they would meet them together, bound by a love that had already defied the world. And in that shared understanding, the room seemed to fade, leaving only two figures standing amid the remnants of expectation, unbroken and unwavering, poised on the edge of everything that society deemed impossible. Winter had descended upon the city with a quiet insistence, and Ashbourne Manor, cloaked in snow, stood like a fortress against the chill of gossip and expectation. The world beyond its walls had not forgotten them, nor relented in its scrutiny, yet within, a fragile peace prevailed. The Duke and Miss Hartwell moved through the familiar halls, their steps measured, every gesture an unspoken claim of shared purpose. Candles flickered along the long corridors, casting shadows that danced like memories, highlighting both the beauty and the cost of their defiance. It had been months since his public declaration, months of whispered malice, letters of warning, and subtle exclusions from the circles that once dictated every action of the aristocracy. Invitations ceased, alliances fractured, and the inherited privileges of Ashbourne's name were eroded by polite but unmistakable ostracism. Yet each hardship only deepened the bond between them, a bond forged not in comfort but in deliberate resistance. In these moments of quiet intimacy, unobserved and unjudged, the Duke revealed not the grandeur of title but the strength of devotion. He was no longer merely a figure of expectation. He was a man choosing, again and again, to live with consequence rather than bow to convenience. She observed him as he walked through the drawing-room. His expression calm yet alert, every line of his posture refined by the weight of responsibility and the burden of choice. He paused before a window, tracing the path of carriages navigating snow-laden streets, and in that stillness, she saw the reflection of every battle they had endured. The air was thick with the scent of pine from the garlands decorating the hearth, mingled with the subtle perfume she always wore, a scent that had become a quiet signal between them. She could feel the past months etched upon him, the sleepless nights, the tension of disapproval, the relentless calculation of risk, and yet the resolve in his eyes had never faltered. "You have borne more than I could have expected," she said softly, stepping beside him. The sound of her voice carried weight, honed by fear and admiration alike. "And yet, here you stand unbroken." He looked at her, dark eyes gleaming with the faintest trace of humor, though tempered by sincerity. "Unbroken, perhaps, but not unscathed. Every step we took against the tide left its mark." His hand brushed hers lightly, a gesture that carried centuries of unspoken history. "And yet, I would choose it again. For you. For us." Outside, the first carriage of the season arrived, gliding over the snow like a shadow of inevitability. Its presence brought with it news that could no longer be deferred, correspondence from those who had dictated futures, from families and titles that had assumed obedience would prevail. A summons to return, a subtle ultimatum, abandon the defiance, restore order, and the world would resume as it had been. Or refuse, and risk everything, from fortune to reputation. The choice, once abstract, now demanded confrontation. The Duke did not hesitate. He met her gaze with a quiet, unassailable certainty. "I have made my choice," he said. "I will not recant, nor will I retreat. The world may cast judgment, but our lives will not be dictated by the fear of whispers." His voice, though calm, carried the undercurrent of all he had endured, the sacrifices endured in silence. It was not bravado, it was truth. She felt the tremor of relief and fear intertwining within her, the delicate thread of hope and anxiety that had characterized their months together. She had imagined this confrontation countless times, each scenario more tragic or improbable than the last. Yet here it was, not as an imagined peril but as tangible reality, and in facing it, she realized the depth of her own resolve. She would stand beside him, as he had chosen to stand beside her, regardless of consequence. The servants moved discreetly, offering refreshments and folding chairs, yet their presence seemed peripheral to the charged atmosphere. Every detail, the flicker of candlelight, the crackle of the fire, the muted thrum of carriages, accentuated the gravity of what was unfolding. The room, intimate in scale, became a stage upon which the culmination of months of courage, defiance, and devotion played out in measured gestures and silences heavier than words. He unfolded the letter from the carriage, scanned its contents with the precision of a man trained in both etiquette and authority, then let it fall, unread aloud, to the table. "They hope to frighten us," he said, a quiet edge in his tone, "to bend our will by recalling the consequences of disobedience. Yet fear cannot undo the certainty of choice once it has been embraced." She moved closer, her hand finding his. The gesture was neither dramatic nor ornamental. It was acknowledgment, commitment, and quiet defiance all at once. Her touch conveyed what words could not: endurance, loyalty, and love honed in adversity. The Duke, feeling the subtle heat of her palm, allowed himself a brief smile, a rare unguarded moment in a life otherwise regimented by expectation. Outside, snow began to fall heavier, drifting against the tall windows and obscuring the world beyond the manor's walls. It was as if nature itself conspired to isolate this act of defiance from the scrutiny of society. Within the room, time slowed, each breath, each glance, and each heartbeat magnified. They had endured whispers, threats, and subtle manipulations, yet they remained standing, not triumphant in wealth or title, but in the far rarer currency of truth and choice. He drew a deep breath, steadying himself, then spoke in a voice imbued with the finality of conviction. "Let it be known, not for the applause of those outside these walls, but for the reality we choose to inhabit. We will live by our own accord, bound to one another by neither convenience nor coercion, but by deliberate devotion. Should the world resist, it shall do so against the certainty of our decision, not the fragility of our hearts." Her eyes glistened in the firelight, reflection of courage, love, and fear mingled in a single gaze. She knew that beyond this room, society would continue its judgment, letters would arrive with thinly veiled threats, and allies might withdraw their support. Yet for the first time, consequence did not terrify her. She had been chosen, not for convenience or appearance, but for who she was, intact in dignity, respected in her essence, and loved fiercely. A sudden gust rattled the windows, and the letter, forgotten on the table, slid to the floor. It was a symbolic punctuation, a reminder that the world outside would always intrude, but also that the choice had already been made. The Duke bent to retrieve it, folding it carefully, and in that simple act, the enormity of their defiance became tangible. They had chosen each other fully, and whatever followed could not undo what had already been wrought. In the final moments before the carriage departed again, bringing messages from beyond, they shared a quiet acknowledgment, a glance that spoke of endurance, triumph, and love unassailable. No words were necessary. The firelight, dancing across their faces, illuminated a future uncharted, yet claimed by intention. They were not safe from society, nor from the consequences that awaited, but they were safe within the certainty of each other's choice. As the snow fell heavier, blanketing the manor in white, they stood together in silence. The Duke's hand found hers, and in that grasp lay all the rebellion, all the courage, all the love that had been tested and tempered over months of scrutiny and whispered threats. Outside, the world waited to challenge them, to demand obedience, to punish audacity. Inside, the world had been reduced to the warmth of shared conviction and the fragile, brilliant triumph of having chosen one another. And in that quiet, immeasurable moment, the narrator might have observed a truth eternal and unyielding. Titles and fortunes fade, whispers and judgment crumble, but love, deliberate, defiant, and fully embraced, remains indestructible and luminous. History might remember his title, society might record scandal, but the true legacy belonged to the choice, the courage, and the hearts that dared to claim it. The door opened softly behind them, a messenger arriving with news that might alter paths, yet they did not turn. For the first time, they understood that the greatest battle had been won within, and whatever awaited beyond those walls was merely a continuation of the world they had already reshaped together.